Lillian Monroe wanted one thing: to be the center of attention. But when her younger siblings began to outshine her, admiration turned to jealousy, and jealousy turned to murder. What drove this once promising daughter to systematically kill her entire family in cold blood? Discover the chilling details behind one of the most twisted family crimes you've never heard of. Backhand index pointing right. Watch now and uncover how love turned lethal in the greedy daughter who killed her entire family because she wasn't the center of attention. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more shocking true crime stories every week. In the quiet, tree-lined town of Green Falls, the Monroe family was admired by nearly everyone. They lived in a spacious two-story home with white shutters and a neatly trimmed lawn. To neighbors and friends, the Monroes were a symbol of stability and success. Robert Monroe, a respected dentist, ran a thriving practice in town. His wife, Cynthia, was known for her elegant presence at school events and fundraisers. Their 3 children, Lillian, Hannah, and Blake, had grown up surrounded by love, comfort, and high expectations. Lillian, the eldest, had once been the pride of the family. She had been the straight-A student, the lead in school plays, and the first to leave for college. Her parents had always expected great things from her, and for a while, she seemed to be on that path. But after college, things hadn't gone according to plan. Lillian struggled to hold a job. She moved back home quietly, without much fanfare, and began sleeping in her old room again, surrounded by childhood trophies and faded posters. While she had been away, everything had changed. Her younger sister Hannah had stepped into the spotlight, winning scholarships and receiving praise for her work in biomedical science. Blake, the youngest, had become a local sports sensation, with coaches already talking about college recruitment and future championships. Cynthia and Robert couldn't hide their pride. Their social media pages were filled with photos of Hannah's awards and Blake's game-winning shots. Lillian was rarely mentioned. At first, she tried to smile through it. She clapped at her siblings' milestones, posted congratulatory comments, and pretended the silence around her own failures didn't sting. But as the months went by, the feeling of invisibility began to consume her. Every dinner table conversation revolved around Hannah's internships or Blake's upcoming tournaments. If she tried to bring up her own life, the topic would quickly shift. It was as if she had become a background character in her own home. Lillian's resentment grew slowly, like a crack spreading through glass. She began avoiding family dinners, staying in her room late into the night. She picked up a part-time job at a clothing store but quit after 2 weeks. She started spending more time online, watching documentaries about crimes, reading about family disputes over inheritance, and obsessively scrolling through posts about toxic family dynamics. Her mind started piecing together patterns, stories of people who had been overlooked and how they had taken control in chilling ways. She began to believe that she wasn't just unlucky or misunderstood, she was being deliberately ignored. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that her family had pushed her aside, choosing instead to invest their time, love, and resources in the better children. Her parents had replaced her. Her siblings were competition. And worst of all, no one seemed to notice that she was falling apart right in front of them. In her isolation, Lillian's envy turned to anger. And her anger slowly transformed into something far more dangerous. Lillian's days grew darker with each passing week. The warmth of family life that once comforted her now felt like a constant reminder of her invisibility. The once familiar sounds of laughter in the kitchen or cheering from the living room became unbearable. She kept her bedroom door closed at all times, often locking it even when she was inside. Meals were eaten alone. Family events were skipped. Her presence in the house became more like that of a stranger than a daughter or sister. Her parents chalked it up to stress and post-college uncertainty. Cynthia occasionally left encouraging notes on her dresser. Robert offered to help her look for work or even support her going back to school. But to Lillian, these gestures felt hollow, like pity, not love. They only made her feel more broken, more forgotten. She had once been the one her parents boasted about. Now she was the family's biggest disappointment. She began cataloging every slight. When Hannah got a new laptop for school, Lillian remembered how she had begged for one years ago and was told to save up. When Blake was driven across the state for basketball tryouts, she recalled the time her parents refused to visit her at college, saying they were too busy. These memories piled up, real or imagined, and they festered like wounds she refused to let heal. Her obsession with crime stories grew. Late at night, long after the house had gone quiet, she would lie in bed scrolling through stories of family betrayals, murder for money schemes, and inheritance disputes. She wasn't reading for entertainment anymore. She was studying. She became fascinated by cases where the motive was control, not revenge. Stories where the person at the center believed they were entitled to something more, something that had been taken from them. She felt a strange sense of validation reading those stories, as if the people involved weren't monsters, just misunderstood. Lillian started tracking her parents' financial habits. She quietly accessed their shared family computer and found budget spreadsheets, insurance policies, and Robert's updated will. The document made her stomach turn. The estate, valued in the millions, was to be split evenly among all 3 children. No recognition of her seniority, no additional share for the child who had paved the way, as she saw it. She felt cheated, robbed of what she believed was rightfully hers. By now, Lillian had fully withdrawn from normal life. She had no job, no friends, no goals. She rarely left the house, except for occasional long drives where she would sit alone in empty parking lots and think. Not just about how things had gone wrong, but about how she could make them right, how she could reclaim the attention, the recognition, and the inheritance that she believed belonged to her. To her, the family had become an obstacle. And in her mind, obstacles could be removed. The thought was still a whisper, something she hadn't fully accepted. But with each day of silence and each look of disappointment, that whisper was getting louder. The first tragedy struck on a rainy Thursday evening in early October. Hannah had stayed late at her university lab, working on a research project she was particularly proud of. She texted her mother that she'd be home after 10. But she never made it inside. Just after 10:30 p.m., Robert found her lying face down in the driveway, motionless. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but it was too late. Hannah was declared dead at the scene, her skull fractured, blood pooling beneath her head. The police investigated but found no signs of foul play. There were no witnesses, no struggle, and nothing stolen. The working theory was that Hannah had slipped on the wet pavement and hit her head on the edge of the concrete step. A tragic accident. The family mourned deeply. Cynthia could hardly speak without breaking down. Robert blamed himself for not hearing anything from inside. Blake became quiet and withdrawn. And Lillian? She seemed calm, composed, even. She helped arrange Hannah's memorial service, printed out programs, and wrote a long post about her sister's beautiful light. She hugged distant relatives and thanked neighbors for their support. But there was something off. People noticed her eyes never quite matched her words. There were no tears, only rehearsed smiles and well-timed sighs. Some assumed she was still in shock, others believed she was simply being strong for the family. But in her mind, things were beginning to shift. The loss of Hannah had changed the household. The once bustling energy was replaced with silence and sorrow. For the first time in years, all attention had shifted to Lillian. She was the one her parents leaned on for strength, the one Blake turned to for comfort. For the first time since returning home, she felt needed again. 3 weeks later, tragedy struck a second time. The family had taken a short hiking trip to a local forest preserve, hoping the change of scenery would help them heal. Blake, who suffered from asthma, carried his inhaler at all times. Lillian had offered to keep a backup in her bag, just in case. During the hike, Blake began to wheeze and panic. His primary inhaler was empty. When Cynthia frantically reached for the backup, it was missing. By the time help arrived, Blake had collapsed. He was pronounced dead from respiratory failure. The death of a second child within a month sent shockwaves through the community. Counselors were brought in. Local news stations covered the story. The Monroe family, once seen as the epitome of suburban success, had become a symbol of devastating loss. Cynthia stopped leaving the house. Robert looked 10 years older overnight. And Lillian, once again, was the pillar, publicly grieving, privately detached. Investigators were baffled. 2 deaths in such a short span of time was rare, but there was no concrete evidence suggesting anything other than terrible luck. Lillian, however, knew otherwise. She had carefully orchestrated both events, ensuring nothing would link her to either. She believed she had finally regained control. And for the first time in a long time, she smiled. In the weeks following Blake's death, The Monroe household was reduced to a shell of what it once was. The laughter, the shared meals, the background noise of television and music, all of it vanished. Cynthia spent her days in bed, surrounded by silence and medication. Robert buried himself in work, taking longer hours at the clinic just to avoid the grief that consumed the walls of his home. The family that once thrived on structure and love was now fragmented, teetering on the edge of collapse. Lillian, however, was thriving in the shadows. She wore grief like a costume, moving through the house with practiced sorrow. She brought Cynthia tea and tissues, reminded Robert to eat, and checked in on bills and errands. To the few family friends still reaching out, she appeared to be the glue holding the family together. But beneath that composed exterior, she was already planning her next move. The estate she had read about in the will was now closer to becoming hers. With 2 siblings gone, her portion had effectively doubled. But she didn't want to wait. The money, the house, the status, it all felt within reach. The only thing standing in her way was her parents. And after what she had already done, removing 2 more obstacles didn't seem like an unthinkable leap. In fact, it felt like a logical next step. What Lillian didn't know was that someone was starting to take notice. Marcus Ellery, a retired detective who had known the Monroes for years, had been quietly observing from a distance. He had attended both funerals and couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the timing of the deaths, it was Lillian herself. The calmness, the lack of emotional depth, the carefully worded social media posts. It all rang false to him. His instincts, sharpened by decades in law enforcement, told him something was off. Curious, Marcus began looking into Lillian's online activity. With the help of a friend still active in digital forensics, he discovered a disturbing pattern. In the weeks leading up to both deaths, Lillian had been researching how to stage accidents, how to tamper with medications, and even the effects of certain sedatives on respiratory systems. Her search history was littered with queries about undetectable poisons, inheritance laws, and case studies of familial homicides. Marcus took what he found to the police, who quietly reopened the investigation. They began collecting digital evidence, tracking Lillian's movements, and examining the scene of Blake's collapse with renewed scrutiny. But before they could intervene, Lillian made her next move. Cynthia and Robert had planned a weekend trip to a coastal retreat, a desperate attempt to find solace. Lillian insisted on staying behind, claiming she needed time alone. That weekend, their house caught fire in the middle of the night. Investigators later determined that the fire had originated in the kitchen, where traces of accelerant were found. The smoke detectors had been tampered with. Only luck, and a neighbor's call, saved Cynthia and Robert from dying in their sleep. The fire department found a pair of gloves in the garage soaked in gasoline. Fingerprint analysis confirmed what the investigators already suspected: they belonged to Lillian. Within days, she was arrested at a local coffee shop, sipping a latte as if nothing had happened. Her calmness never wavered. But the mask she wore so well had finally cracked. The arrest of Lillian Monroe sent shockwaves through Green Falls. Word spread quickly that the grieving daughter, once praised for her composure and strength, had been hiding something monstrous all along. News vans parked outside the family home. Former classmates and neighbors gave shocked interviews about how they never would have guessed. But beneath the community's disbelief was a chilling realization: a daughter, driven by jealousy and greed, had systematically destroyed her own family. The trial began 3 months later. The courtroom was packed on the first day, with reporters lining the hallways. Lillian entered in a modest gray sweater and slacks, her expression blank. Gone was the warm, attentive daughter everyone remembered. In her place stood a woman who looked untouched by remorse. Her defense attorneys painted her as mentally unstable, a young woman whose mind had unraveled under the pressure of family expectations and unresolved trauma. They argued that her actions were not calculated, but the result of a psychotic break triggered by feelings of worthlessness and exclusion. The prosecution saw things differently. They laid out their case with chilling clarity. Lillian had deliberately killed her sister Hannah by striking her in the head and staging it to appear as an accident. She had caused Blake's death by tampering with his inhaler and hiding the backup he depended on to breathe. She had then tried to murder her own parents by setting the house on fire while they slept, hoping to make it look like a tragic electrical failure. The motive: money, attention, and a deeply rooted resentment that had slowly turned into hatred. As the trial progressed, more evidence emerged. Forensic analysts confirmed that Hannah's injuries did not match a simple fall. They were consistent with blunt force trauma from behind. The inhaler Blake had used was found to have been emptied and refilled with water. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station showed Lillian purchasing fuel just hours before the house fire. Her internet history revealed obsessive searches about inheritance law, arson techniques, and undetectable toxins. It was a web of premeditated cruelty. Psychiatrists called by the prosecution described Lillian as having narcissistic personality traits and a profound lack of empathy. She wasn't insane, they argued. She was calculating, entitled, and utterly convinced of her own victimhood. During testimony, Cynthia and Robert sat motionless in the front row, their faces pale and unreadable. Their daughter had murdered their children and tried to murder them. And now they were forced to watch her stand trial for those crimes. After weeks of testimony and cross-examination, the jury took less than a day to reach a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts. Lillian was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply stared straight ahead, as if she hadn't heard a word. Today, Cynthia and Robert live in seclusion under new names, far from Green Falls. Their once-perfect family exists only in photos and painful memories. Lillian Monroe's name became a grim legend, a reminder of how envy, left unchecked, can consume everything in its path.